Hi, I'm Damian Perry. I'm the president of the Arlington Independent Media Board. This is the third of 5 candidate forums. We'll be speaking with 2 candidates for Commonwealth's Attorney. Our panel for this discussion is Hannah Dannon-Feltzer, community volunteer, Wilma Jones, a community activist and civic leader, and Christian Dorsey, the chair of the Arlington County Board. In this episode, our panelists will be speaking with Josh Katcher, a candidate for Commonwealth's Attorney.
Hi, Josh. Let's start off this evening with a question about your motivation. What motivated you to run for Commonwealth's Attorney?
So I decided to run for Commonwealth's Attorney because I believe that we're failing to deliver on the promise of 21st century reform. And I'm concerned that a failed execution of reform could be misinterpreted as a failed philosophy. And to me, that would be a terrible outcome for this community.
Our community is having a lot of conversations about crime and whether it's increasing, and if so, what are some of the causes? What are your perspectives on this topic?
I think the fact that crime is rising is objectively true. I believe the numbers, crimes against person last year were up 16%, property crimes were up 23% year over year. So that it is happening is objectively a fact. I've really not gotten into the causal connections between what's resulting in that crime because I think everyone acknowledges that crime has a lot of contributing factors. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a statistician, I can't particularly math well. I don't think I could prove independently what one thing is happening that's leading to rising crime. But the way I typically talk about this is I think that we need to acknowledge that Arlington County is an affluent community and we're adjacent to a jurisdictional border, which means that we're going to be a target. I don't think that on certain types of crimes we should allow ourselves to be perceived as a soft target. Those crimes include carjacking, gangs, guns, violence, and serious drug dealing.
So how would you characterize the current relationship between the Commonwealth's Attorney's Office and the Arlington County Police Department? Are there any changes you want to see in that relationship? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I don't think there is a relationship between the Commonwealth Attorney's Office and the Police Department. Based on their endorsement this week, the language that was part of that press release, they made it very clear that characterizing the relationship as being good is just not true. I know that because when I was in the office, I could see that the relationship was strained. I've heard that from police officers in different agencies, but especially in ACPD. How do you change that? Because I think it's a problem if we're trying to accomplish things and not having a good working relationship with our local police department. It starts by treating them and the cases and the hard work they put in with respect. It's something that I've done for 11 years when I was a prosecutor. Back before I had kids, I would routinely go on ride-alongs just so I knew what police officers were experiencing out on the streets. And it carries forward through to the way that you handle your cases. If you're going to work out a case and you don't need a police officer, something as simple as letting them know they're not going to be needed, waving them off beforehand, that goes a long way. Sometimes you're going to have disagreements with the police officers, but I think if you approach it with respect and professionalism, you talk them through and you acknowledge maybe the hard work they put in, but maybe something they want to see happen is not what you think is appropriate or what the community would want to see as appropriate. I think if you take the time to really engage in that discussion as opposed to just having them show up and letting them know that the case was worked out, it goes a long way. Finally, you can do something called roll call trainings. There's roll calls more than 3, but at least 3 every day. And as a prosecutor, I think if you show up on a regular basis and make yourself available to answer questions or to proactively do training, just to be present, I think that's also the type of thing that leads to a good, productive relationship. And everything I hear is that that relationship is in shambles. The one thing that I've heard repeatedly from people on the doors I knock is that they've heard from police officers that there's a view that the Commonwealth Attorney's Office is not taking accountability seriously anymore, at least on certain types of cases. And I can completely understand why that would leave police officers demoralized when they're doing hard and tough investigations.
Okay, let's talk about some programs. Can you share your insight into diversion programs that are currently in place to avoid criminal prosecution or a criminal conviction for the offenders?
Sure. There are some formalized programs within the county, and there are also ones outside of the county or maybe third-party programs. But diversion is the general way we think about having a case that we've identified as something that would be worthy of putting on some type of probationary period, and that can either be pre-plea or post-plea. And you do it with an eye towards usually giving someone an opportunity to get on a trajectory out of the system and onto into a better place. And those are the type of cases that I routinely talk about when I talk about real reform. I describe them as being usually the mentally ill, the unhoused, the addicted, kids doing dumb kid things. They're the type of cases that the justice system is not going to solve that problem. It's a type of case that if there was an off-ramp that had been created by an external policymaker, the case probably would have never found itself into the court system. So for example, if you've got kids in the school system that are doing something that technically rises to the level of a crime, but realistically, from a decency and a human standpoint, we don't really want to involve them in the court system. You can engage in restorative justice. There are formalized restorative justice programs in the community. There's also the type of informal restorative justice you can do. So for example, having been a prosecutor for 11 years and having spent some time on the fourth floor, which is the juvenile and domestic relations floor, I can remember an instance when you had one kid push another kid up against a locker, and that was an assault and battery. Now, I don't know about you guys, when I was in school, that happened to me. I may or may not have been involved in that myself. It would have never gone anywhere near the justice system. And so when I took a look at a case like that, I said, this is insane. This should not be in the justice system. Let's get the parents together, let's get the kids together all in one room, and let's just essentially talk it out. And in a way, that's a form of restorative justice. Likewise, if you have a 17-year-old or a 20-year-old, and it's their first offense, they go down to Macy's, they go down to Crystal City, they commit a shoplifting. It's $86 in sunglasses or what have you. There is a shoplifting program called STOP, and it's basically a victim awareness program that someone goes to, they learn a little bit about what it means to be a victim of a crime. It gives them a greater, hopefully, idea of what empathy should look like in that set of circumstances. And my favorite part about it is when I went and taught those classes was, hey guys, hey gals, do you think that this is going to be a good profession for you? And they'd start laughing, and I would say, it's not. You all got caught. And there are loss prevention officers that are out there, and there are all those cameras up there. And it was the type of, again, program that a kid or a young adult could go through and come out on the other side without a conviction. Finally, we've got substance abuse programs within and without the county that it takes a while to kind of learn up and learn about. When you're a brand new prosecutor, you do not come equipped with the knowledge of the full host of programs within our county and in the neighboring jurisdictions. The list is almost too long to go through right now. But again, they're the type of thing that I personally feel that we're not going to incarcerate our way out of addiction. And so when we have an opportunity to hook someone up with a substance abuse program and get them on a better path, that's exactly what we should be doing.
So, the County of Arlington and City of Falls Church are going to elect a Commonwealth Attorney, but of course, in order to perform the function, you've got an office that has prosecutors, it has staff that serve victims and witnesses, as well as other support professionals. Do you think that the current human resources of the Commonwealth Attorney Office are sufficient to deliver on your vision of what you've described as real reform? And if not, what resources are needed to effectively pursue that vision?
I do not. I think that is central to my campaign. One of the reasons I'm running is because I believe that the office is not setting up line prosecutors to succeed. We've lost 14 attorneys in the past year and a half. To be clear, that is not the Great Resignation, nor is that including attorneys that have gone on to be judges. And basis for comparison, Alexandria, which is similarly situated to Arlington County, in that same period of time, I should say in the same period of time we lost 13, they lost 3. Prince William County, twice our size, in that same period that we lost 13, lost 10. I give that to you as a basis for comparison because I can tell you anecdotally, having worked with all the people who left, that they were leaving because of the way they were most, I would say, I want to be very precise, to be fair. The main reason many of them were leaving was because of the way that the office was being mismanaged. And I know that because we had those discussions. They came in, they spoke to me, we all worked in the line together. And I think when you have that many people leave the office in that short of a time, you not only lose the experience that is necessary so that you have junior prosecutors trained up by supervisors and mentors, but you also then have a capacity issue on the top end. Your most senior prosecutors are then ultimately responsible for more serious cases, which undermines their ability to address each one of those good. And then more importantly, your junior prosecutors are forced to try more serious cases prior to being ready to do so. And the reform cases that I just talked about, the ones that we want to divert out of the system, those are usually being handled by the more junior prosecutors. But as I told you, there's a lot that goes into understanding how, when, and why to do that. And they need to get the reps, and they need to do that with a mentor or a supervisor. So I think from a staffing standpoint, we have an issue based on the number we've lost. We also have a response to a recent FOIA request of Arlington County HR that indicates that as recently as I think 3 weeks ago, there were 9 fully funded vacant attorney positions. So about a third of the office's capacity is down. That's a problem. And then finally, there are also some support staff and victim witness, those are the assistants that help out with cases that have victims, that are also vacant. I think when you've got that type of across-the-board capacity issue, you're perilously close to not being able to do the core functions in the office. And you're certainly not able to do the kind of the other types of programs that you would want to be able to send your staff and your deputies off to. Like one of the things that I'm specifically talking about in my campaign is I want my deputies and I want my line prosecutors to go to PTA meetings and I want them to go to civic association meetings. If you've got them completely understaffed and undersupported, to ask them to do that on top of everything else, I think is probably just a bridge too far.
So Josh, in terms of the qualifications for this role, do you think that criminal trial experience is part of that? And why is that? Why would that be?
I think the analogy that comes to mind is if you had a heart problem, you would not go to the best brain surgeon on the planet, right? And I often say that in response to the idea that my opponent is an appellate attorney, which means that when she was at the public defender's office in DC, she wasn't doing trial work, right? Being a trial attorney is a specific type of responsibility, specific type of skill set. Defense attorneys can become prosecutors. I'm not in any way trying to suggest they can't do that, but they're still trial attorneys. So the question really here is, why are so many people leaving the office? And my response is because you can't lead a team to do something you've never done yourself. You can't train them up because you don't know how to try the cases down in court because you haven't done it yourself. You can't really empathize with the stresses of being a line prosecutor or the vicarious trauma you're constantly sustaining if you're doing, say, sexually violent crimes or violent crimes. And then finally, I think that many of the reformers who've occupied positions of top prosecutors have come into the system with a focus on the injustices in the system. And I'm not in any way denying that. Those injustices are systemic and historic and have been there for years. But many of the reformers come at this from a place of being an appellate attorney, maybe a defense attorney, maybe a policymaker, maybe a professor, and when they become the prosecutors, they are almost myopically focused on the outcomes of the defendant. And I think the way that prosecutors really ought to operate is to be focused on justice for victims. The importance of having an appropriate outcome for the defendant is served by engaging in just prosecutions and only seeking just and equitable outcomes. And so the point I'm getting at here is that I think that the ethos of the office in Arlington County has unfortunately de-emphasized justice for victims. And I don't just say that from my own experience or from things I'm hearing in the community, but also from things I'm hearing from within the office and from police officers.
So let's talk about our youth. With the recent increase in youth access to illicit substances and the uptake in gun violence in our schools, or in Arlington, just bringing guns onto school premises, how do you plan on dealing with juvenile offenders?
I think when I talk about reform prosecution, I always start by saying what it really means for me is humanizing and contextualizing cases. And that is all the more so in the case of juvenile justice. It is fiendishly complex. The two default positions, I think, for all reform prosecutors is the best place for a kid is not in the system. The second default is if they are going to be in the system, they should not be treated or tried as an adult. That is essentially my North Star when it comes to juvenile justice. So there are really kind of two questions as I see it. One, what are we doing about what's happening in schools? And two, if they find their way to the system, how do we respond to that? The schools is the more difficult question because obviously I'm not on the school board. And really the only impact the prosecutor can have is indirectly impacting what's happening in the school system. And I always want to be candid about what this job actually will allow. The lane is to be the top prosecutor. And yet, if you're trying cases on the fourth floor, which I think the Commonwealth Attorney should do, you're going to be exposed to a lot of information because you've got GALs, guardian ad litems, you've got cases that are CHINs, which is a child in need of services. You learn a lot about what's going on in the system by just being down there. You also learn a lot by going to PTA meetings and talking to parents. And I think there's a responsibility of the Commonwealth Attorney to then use that information and relay that information to the stakeholders in APS so that they have full information. What comes to mind is that the awful incident where the young man overdosed and died on fentanyl. It feels avoidable because 18 months, well, I guess at this point, 24 months ago, we started hearing about fentanyl getting into the schools via the vice detectives. I've spoken to people who were down at Wakefield who said the administration was kind of vaguely aware, teachers were vaguely aware, and there's this mentality sometimes of just staying in your lane or staying in your silo. I think as the top elected law enforcement officer, I would have no problem going to the APS superintendent and say, listen, this is what we're hearing about. We've got some concerns. Do you guys have a plan in place for this? Giving some time, and if ultimately nothing is said, maybe going public and using the bully pulpit to pull this monster out of the closet and confront it. So as for what's happening in the schools, use the intelligence and make sure that the schools and the community at large is aware of what's going on. As for juvenile justice, really, I think it's a question of who do you trust and who do you think has the value set and experience to handle those cases appropriately. They're tough. That's why experience is so important, not only for the person handling the case, but for the person who's learning how to handle the case. And that's why, again, come back to the fact that when we have an office essentially in free fall, when the most senior, experienced Virginia prosecutor only has 6 years of experience, we're setting our line prosecutors up to not succeed on those cases, and the outcomes are not going to be in alignment with what we want to do.
So, Josh, let's return to systemic racism, which you referenced earlier. And I promise I won't make you do math or statistics, but there is a clear disproportionality as it relates to African Americans, as it relates to arrests, incarceration, convictions. And is this evidence of the systemic racism that you addressed earlier? And then what is the role of the Commonwealth Attorney in dismantling this, if we can all agree that that's a bad thing?
We can agree it's a bad thing. We can agree it's a real thing. I think that's table stakes, or at least I hope it does, for anyone who's going to be a prosecutor anywhere in this country. And everyone in my office will absolutely, they will agree with that because I believe in that. What's the role of the Commonwealth Attorney there? Well, I think a case that always comes to mind for me is a good starting point. I had a case that was, I think it was about a 60-year-old man who was found with a concealed weapon on his person. Ordinarily, that would be a Class 1 misdemeanor in Virginia. I think it was just tucked in his belt pocket. However, if you are a felon who's got a prior felony conviction and you're found with the exact same set of circumstances, all of a sudden you're a felon in possession of a firearm. And so it's a felony as opposed to a Class 1 misdemeanor. And the difference between a felony and a misdemeanor is oceans. So I looked at that case, 60-year-old guy, what was his felony for? Turns out he had a 1984, 1985 conviction from Washington, D.C. for possession of crack cocaine. And I remember looking at that and thinking, that happened 40 years ago. And then, because, history, I always come back to the idea that in the 1980s, we treated a crack epidemic very different than the way we treated an opiate epidemic in the early 2000s, right? And I think we all know the majority of the people who were getting felony convictions during the 1980s crack epidemic were black men and women, people of color. Certainly wasn't white people. In early 2000s, we have an opiate epidemic. Yes, opiates were widespread in this country, but it was an epidemic that impacted white people at a much higher rate. And what were the ultimate outcomes there? Substance abuse, treatment, the type of things we want people to get when they have a substance abuse addiction. And yet we have this black man who is 60 years old. He's coming into the system. I took one look at that, and once I saw that it was a 1984 crack conviction out of Washington, D.C., I said to myself, I'm not going to prosecute this man for a felony, especially because if I recall, he had 15 or so years of good behavior. Nothing had happened since then. So, the great news was that he appears to have gotten out from underneath that. I think we need prosecutors that have that historical perspective in the forefront of their mind so that when they are looking at these cases, they can come up with equitable outcomes. I think that's critically important and an important part of the reform movement. Because when I talk about equitable and just outcomes, that's an example of it.
So Josh, we're starting to get to the end of this conversation a little bit here, and we wanted to focus on asking you about something that's been a really hot button issue within this campaign, which is a recent tragedy of a teenage boy being killed in a drunk driving accident. So your campaign has run ads around this issue that's happened recently, and quite a bit of the content focuses on the mother of the son who was killed. And so we wanted to ask, it focuses on as well as the interaction that the incumbent has had with the family. Can you talk a little bit about why that was the focus in your campaign ads, this relationship between the incumbent and the family?
Absolutely. I became a prosecutor because I believe in justice for victims. That is bedrock for my prosecutor philosophy. And I think it is for many people who become prosecutors. What does justice for victims actually mean? When I look at this case, there are two things that you can consider. The first is the experience that the family had with the system, and in particular with the prosecutor's office. And the second is the ultimate outcome. And you'll notice if you look at all my public statements, I don't particularly talk about the ultimate outcome. Because as I said, juvenile justice is fiendishly complex. I don't have all the facts in the case. And so really, I wouldn't feel comfortable saying, I wouldn't really feel comfortable commenting on the ultimate outcome. But having done 11 years of prosecution as a violent crime prosecutor, there is a right way to interact with the victim's family. And I say that because I've had cases that I tried and lost, and still, in speaking with the victim's family, felt and was told that they had felt like they'd been heard and seen and treated. And so that's, I think, why I'm so focused on what the Meade family experienced in this case. When you interact with a victim, especially a victim who sustained a serious trauma, it's tough as a prosecutor. The first time you do it, you probably don't really know how to do it. And that's why experience is important. What I've learned is what you always need to do is literally and metaphorically meet them where they are. I've tried MS-13 cases where we had victims who were literally working at construction sites, and I would go meet them there. And in this instance, from everything I've heard, my opponent did not meet the family where they were. And in fact, they felt like they were not even heard. They felt that the outcome was inflicted on them beforehand. They felt that what was going to happen with the young man who was driving under the influence of alcohol, that he was the focus of the prosecution. And, I can't begin to empathize with what that must have felt like when a family is at the lowest point of their life, having lost their son in a DUI crash, and then to have that experience from the prosecutor's office, which I think most people go into thinking that they're going to have someone who's going to listen and be an advocate for them or something of an advocate for them. I think the fact that they felt re-victimized by the system is the worst outcome that could have occurred. And so that's how I really approach this case. I'm focused on the experience that the victims had from the prosecutor's office.
So Josh, we've come to the conclusion of our conversation. Thank you very much. We appreciate your having a chance to sit with us, and take care.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks.